Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We now move to the next chapter in the Kitab al-Bay' about giving back better than what you borrowed. The narration from Abu Rafi', he says, the Prophet took as a loan a young camel below the age of 6, and then thereafter the camels of Sadaqah were brought to him, and he ordered Abu Rafi' to return back the camel which the Prophet borrowed. But Abu Rafi' says that from the camels of the Sadaqah, I only found the better quality camels above the age of 6. And the Prophet said to Abu Rafi', أعطه إياه إن خيار الناس أحسنهم قضاءً. Give that to him. The best of people are those who are best in repaying their loan. In this hadith we find there is no problem in giving back a better quality item than you took. But this is about the quality, not the quantity. So if you borrow some wheat of poor quality, let's say, of 1 sa', and you pay back 1 sa' of wheat of high quality, then there is no problem in this, because it's the quality, not the quantity. But what about the quantity? If you pay back more in quantity than you took, is this also riba? Well, the answer is no. This is not riba. If you took 1 sa' of dates to borrow, and then you gave back 2 sa' of dates, this is not riba on the condition that you did not make this extra payment a condition at the time of taking the loan out. Because if you did, then that will be clear riba, and as the Prophet says, كُلُّ قَرْضٍ يَجُرُّ مَنْفَعَةً فَهُوَ riba. Any loan which brings about a benefit, then it is riba. But this is the case when you stipulate this particular benefit. As for if a person who took out the loan just gives extra from his own goodness of his heart, then there is no problem in that, and it is not riba. And we also take from the hadith that the best of people are those who are best in repaying their loan. So this could be that you pay back a better quality than you took. Also it includes that you do not procrastinate in paying back your loan, and also that you do not give it back with pride, such that you're doing somebody a favor. And we can also take the obvious lesson that you are allowed to take out a loan, even though one must avoid it as far as is possible, because you do not want to be in a debt. However, taking out a halal loan, an interest-free loan, is permissible, as this hadith clearly indicates. In another narration of the chapter, we find that the person whom this camel was owed to, so the lender, spoke to the Prophet in an uncivil manner when he demanded his debt back. This angered the companions, to which the Prophet said, إِنَّ لِصَاحِبِ الْحَقِّ مَقَالًا. The one who has the right is entitled to speak. So even though this person spoke to the Prophet in a rude fashion, the Prophet still defended his rights. So just ponder at the exalted standard of character of the Prophet ﷺ. He told the companions to buy a camel for him and give it. They said, we only find the better camels of a higher age, and the Prophet told them, buy it and give it to him, because the best of you are those who are best in paying off their debt. We ask a question at this point: is it permissible for the one who has lent money and the borrower procrastinates, is it permissible for the lender to speak about the procrastinator behind his back? As for in front of him, it is clear-cut enough. He could criticize the procrastinator, but behind his back, can you speak about him? So could you say that such and such a person is lazy, he does not pay back his debt, he is a procrastinator? No one would want such a thing to be said about them. So is this permissible? Well, the answer is yes, it is, and it is not ghiba, the rebuked form of backbiting. This is permissible because you're doing it for a valid reason. You're warning people that this is a procrastinator, he does not pay back his debts. And Allah Jalla wa Ala says, لا يحب الله الجهر بالسوء من القول إلا من ظلم وكان الله سميعا بصيرا. Allah does not like that one should raise his voice in speaking badly, except for the one who has been wronged, and Allah was ever the hearer, the seer. Also from the narration we find that the Prophet told others to buy on his behalf, and this is tawqeel, to make somebody else a wakil, or someone who discharges your affairs for you. This is permissible. We move to the next chapter about trading an animal for an animal of the same type, but not in the same quantity. From Jabir, he says, there came a servant who gave the pledge of allegiance to the Prophet to make hijrah. The Prophet did not realize that he was a servant. Thereafter, the master of this servant came, and the Prophet asked the master to sell the servant to him. And so the Prophet bought this servant in exchange for 2 black servants. And after that, the Prophet never gave the pledge of allegiance to anyone until he asked him, "Are you a servant?" The Prophet bought this servant because if he did not, his master would simply take him back, and the servant would not be able to make hijrah. So to prevent this from happening, to prevent this person from being completely disappointed after having given the pledge of allegiance, the Prophet had to purchase him. We take it is permissible to sell 1 servant for 2 servants, and that this is not riba because people are not ribawi items. And the majority of the scholars say that the same goes with animals as well, so 1 camel for 2 camels and so on. And also we take an interesting fa'idah from this narration. The asl, or the default ruling about people, is that they are not servants. Notice here the Prophet gave the pledge of allegiance. He did not ask him, "Are you a servant or not?" because it is assumed, as it is the default ruling, that a person is not a servant, he is free. It's only after the Prophet realized that he was not a free person, he was a servant. And of course the Prophet does not know the unseen, as opposed to the people who go to extremes who claim that the Prophet knows the unseen. Now, on the topic of selling an animal for an animal, is it permissible or not? Is it riba or not? There are 2 conflicting narrations. One narration in Al-Bazzar says that the Prophet forbade selling an animal for an animal on deferred payment. And in another narration of Abdullah ibn Amr, he said that the Prophet was preparing an army and the camels ran out. So what the Prophet did was that he took 1 camel from the camels of charity and paid for every 1 camel he took 2 camels back to be paid at a later date. So these are 2 conflicting reports, and the way we would reconcile between them is to say that if in selling the animal for an animal you intend to eat the meat of the animal, then riba would enter it because the meat is something weighed and is food, and that would be a ribawi item then. So if in selling these animals what you intend is the meat, then riba would come into play, and therefore deferred payment is not permitted. However, in selling an animal for an animal, what you intend is to use the animal, so for riding, then that is not a ribawi item anymore. So you're allowed to sell 1 for 2 and deferred payment and so on. Riba does not even enter into it, because what is your intention? Your intention is to simply ride the animal, and that is not a ribawi item anymore, whereas meat is a ribawi item. So notice this fine difference. Let us move on to this next chapter about the rahan, whether you're resident or on a journey. The rahan meaning a pledge. From Aisha, she says that the Prophet bought some food from a Yahudi to be paid for at a later date, but he gave the Yahudi his coat of mail as a pledge. Now this incident took place in Al-Madinah, so you're allowed to give a pledge whether you are on a journey or whether you are resident. In the Quran, Allah Jalla wa Ala mentions a rahan when you are on a journey, and this is to secure the debt for the vendor. The ayah mentions when you are on a journey and there is no scribe to write down this debt. So the vendor does not have a means to secure the debt. So in a case like this, he may take possession of a rahan. Otherwise, we say it is not a condition that you should be on a journey and that there should be no scribe to write down this debt. That is not a condition. The Quran is simply mentioning the worst case scenario for the vendor. We know also that the Prophet died and this coat of mail was still in the possession of the Yahudi. But is it a condition that the rahan should be actually physically ceased possession of? Or could it be that you give a rahan, but he has not physically ceased possession of it, and this still is a valid rahan? Well, there are 2 opinions on this. One opinion says that if he ceases possession of the rahan, so physically takes possession, then the rahan becomes binding on the debtor. If the vendor does not seize possession, then the rahan is not binding on the debtor, that is the purchaser in our case, and that the purchaser, the debtor, can annul the rahan. The second and correct opinion is that no, as long as you agree to a rahan, it becomes binding on the debtor or the purchaser, and he is not allowed to annul it. As for the vendor, then it is an aqdun jaiz from his side, so he is allowed to annul it because it's his right. The rahan is a right for the vendor against the debtor or the purchaser. So upon this, the purchaser could give his car as a rahan, yet still be driving the car, or give his house as a rahan, yet still be living in the house. So in other words, physically ceasing possession of the rahan is not a condition for the rahan to become binding on the purchaser. We also know that the wealth of the Yahud normally would be haram earning, yet the Prophet still dealt with them. Why? Because as far as his dealing with the Yahudi was concerned, it was a halal dealing, and that is what matters. As for what happened previously with the wealth of the Yahudi, eating up people's wealth unlawfully and so on, that sin will be upon him. And we say about this narration what we said about the last narration of the Prophet borrowing the camel. You should try not to get yourself in a state of debt. Yet we find in this narration the Prophet is in a state of debt, and he owes the Yahudi the money for the food. So it is not haram to be in a state of debt, as these couple of narrations clearly prove. But we say it is preferable for you to avoid debt, because the Prophet did make dua to avoid being in a state of debt. One might ask, but how can the Prophet give his coat of mail to the Yahudi where this is a military equipment, and the Yahud are known for their treachery? All the tribes in Al-Madinah proved to be treacherous to the Prophet. We say yes, this is generally the case. However, if you feel safe that there will not be any treachery, then there is no problem in dealing with the Yahud or any other person for that matter, and even giving them a military item. Also in the chapter, the statement of Ibrahim al-Nakha'i from the Tabi'een, who says that you're allowed to give a rahan in the salam transaction as well. The transaction of salam is the next chapter, but it is simply when a person pays up front for the goods to be delivered at a later date. He says that a rahan can be given in the salam transaction as well. And this is by way of qiyas, and it is perfectly reasonable to say this because the Prophet gave a rahan, which is a coat of mail, because he was going to pay at a later date. So if you just reverse the process and sell at a later date, which is what the salam is, you give the item at a later date, but the price you take it right now, then the rahan should be given for this as well, even if you reverse the process. So the rahan in a salam trade would be that the vendor now would give a rahan to the purchaser, such that if the vendor is unable to deliver the goods at the particular date, then the purchaser would sell the rahan and take back his money. Some scholars oppose this. They use the hadith in Sunan Abi Dawud, "Man aslafa fi shay'in fala yasrifhu ila ghayrihi." Whoever makes a salam trade, then let him not change it for other than what he paid for. And they say, well, if he sells the rahan off, then he's taking something other than what he paid for. Because let's suppose he gave money for wheat to be given to him after 1 year, and supposing the vendor is unable to deliver the wheat after 1 year. So the purchaser is going to take the rahan which the vendor gave him, sell it and take back his money. So what's happened is that the purchaser is not taking wheat anymore, he's taking back something else. That is the price of the rahan. And so he's changing the product to something else, and the hadith says that he must not change it to other than what he paid for. However, this hadith in Sunan Abi Dawud is weak and is not to be acted upon. And what is correct is that the debt of the salam is just like any other debt. Let us move to the Babu Salam. From Ibn Abbas, he says that the Prophet arrived in Al-Madinah and people would be paying in advance for fruits. They would pay 1 or 2 years in advance. And the Prophet, commenting on this practice, said, "Man aslafa fi tamrin falyuslif fi kaylin ma'lum wa waznin ma'lum ila ajalin ma'lum." Whoever pays in advance for fruit, then let him pay for a known measure or a known weight, and the fruits to be received at a known date. And so this is what the Buyu Salam or the Buyu Salaf, same thing, this is what it is. You pay in advance for your item, as opposed to deferred payment, which is when you would take your commodity and pay at a later date. Normally this would happen with people selling fruits and crops. The seller would want money right now, but he does not have the fruits yet to sell. So how will he make the money? Well, he just takes advance payment, and he will deliver the fruits at a later date. Normally, if you pay at a later date for an item, you would need to pay more than if you were to pay up front. And that is understandable, because the one who pays later, it is his advantage. So the other party would want to counteract that advantage by making him pay more. That is understandable. A salam is the opposite way around. You pay before you receive the item. And so because of this, you would pay less. because it's just the complete opposite. So if normally a sa' of dried dates would go for, let's say, 1 riyal, then in a Bay'u Salam, if you wanted a sa' of dates to be given to you at a later date, but you're paying now, then you would pay less than 1 riyal. Because paying before you receive the item means you're putting yourself at a disadvantage, and so therefore you would balance the scales, if you like, by paying less. And the reverse opposite would be that you pay at a later date, that is, after you receive the item. So that is your advantage. So then the other party would want to, if you like, balance the scales by making you pay more. So anyway, this salam transaction or salaf transaction is permissible. The Prophet allowed it, but he did stipulate some conditions, that it needs to be a known amount of fruit, either through the measure of sa' or through the weight. And of course the date of delivery must be known, otherwise the transaction would contain gharar, when you either do not know whether you receive the item or not, or you are not sure how the item will look like or feel like or taste like when it is delivered. So there is some hazard involved and uncertainty. This can obviously lead to disputes and feeling of animosity. One may ask the question here, why did the Prophet not stipulate a known place for the delivery of the fruits? If he has stipulated a known time, then why not a known place? And the answer to that is that the default rule is that the place of delivery of the item will be the same as the place where you contracted this debt, the debt of salam. So that is the default position, and we do not therefore need to make this as a stipulation if it's already the default position. Yes, it's true, if you want the items to be delivered at a different place, then yes, you would have to stipulate that. But in the absence of any such stipulations, we resort to our default rule, which is that the items must be delivered at the place where you agreed to this contract. We ask another question about this stipulated time period. Do you have to actually mention the date? Or is it enough to say, I will deliver it to you at the time when the dates are harvested, let's say? Definitely, stipulating an actual date is safer. But for us to now say that this is a strict condition is a little more difficult, as some eminent scholars have said that in stipulating this time period, it is enough to say, I will deliver it to you at the time when the dates are harvested. So that time period, and not exactly a specific date. But we say, even if it is not a strict condition to stipulate an actual specific date, we say it is definitely safer to do so, and we encourage that option to be pursued. Note that in another version of the hadith, it says, Man aslafa fi shay'in, whoever pays in advance for anything. So this matter does not have to be restricted to fruits. But the only condition here is that whatever item it is, it must be something which has a constant description to it. So normally with these items manufactured in factories, let's say like phones or chinaware and so on, they all look the same. There's no way that you're going to get them mixed up, and so that is fine, where they all look the same. But as for if they vary vastly from one item to the other, then this produces much gharar, much uncertainty, because you do not know what type of item you will receive. Is it going to be large or small, or what color will it be, and so on. As for if the items remain constant, like dates for example, they are generally constant in their nature, then these are the types of items which are allowed to be paid for in advance. Selling homes or flats by way of salam is not permissible, because these things vary vastly in terms of how they look, how they feel inside. In order to know whether you want to purchase a house or not, you would actually need to enter the home and absorb the atmosphere and really get a feel for the environment. And that cannot happen unless the home is actually made. So paying in advance for one via salam is not permitted. It is possible to purchase a home after you have seen it, or perhaps you have seen the interior design and layout of the home. So we're talking about the plan of the home on paper. But as for merely a description of the home, so a verbal description, then this would not suffice. The next chapter is about hoarding foodstuff. From Ma'mar radiallahu anhu, he says that the Prophet ﷺ said, Man ihtakara fahuwa khati. And in another wording, La yahtakiru illa khati. that no one hoards commodities except a sinner. So hoarding here means that you refuse to sell certain items which the people need, be it foodstuff or clothing or eating and drinking vessels and so on. And then when these items become scarce, their demand will increase rapidly, and hence you are able to sell them at a very high price because there is such a high demand. Why? Because of the scarcity of these items which you artificially produced. That is to say, you artificially produced the scarcity of these items by hoarding them up. However, if somebody does commit to this sin and he hoards up the items, produces the scarcity, and then wants to sell them at a very high price or at an extortionate rate, then the authority would have to force him to sell these items at the normal price. However, we say hoarding can be of two types. The first one is the blameworthy type, which is what this hadith speaks about, the one we have just mentioned and described. There is a second type, which is a person is going to hoard up, let's say, a particular food item to sell it at its normal price at a later date, but not now, currently. Why would he want to do that? Because he knows that at a later date, this particular item will be scarce. Maybe it will not be in harvest, or whatever other reason there may be, but it will be scarce. And so selling it at that time will be more beneficial to the community than selling it now. So if that's his intention, then this is a noble intention and not blameworthy, and hence this hoarding is not blameworthy either, because he's not creating artificial scarcity of the item just to give himself an excuse to raise the price extortionately when there is an extremely high demand later on. So notice the difference. Let's take the next chapter about the prohibition of taking an oath when you're selling something. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Al-halifu manfaqatun lis-sil'a, mamhaqatun lil-ribh." Taking an oath when you sell something will certainly sell your commodity, but it will destroy the profit. Or we can translate it to the blessing. In another wording from Abu Qatada, the Prophet said, إِيَّاكُمْ وَكَثْرَةِ الْحَلَفِ فِي الْبَيْعِ فَإِنَّهُ يُنَفِّقُ ثُمَّ يَمْحَقُ. Beware of taking much oath in the sales transaction, because it will sell the item but destroy the blessing. We can divide this idea of taking an oath in your sales transaction into some groups. Number one would be that you take many oaths. So every time you sell something, it is by way of an oath. And this is what this narration says. Do not do so, because it will destroy the blessing in your earning. The second type would be that you just outright lie in your oath. So you say, Wallahi, I bought this for £20, whereas actually you bought it for £15. And you do this so in order the purchaser gives you £20. This will definitely destroy the barakah, because it is out and out deception. However, we can have the third type as well, which is when you take an oath where you have to. Maybe the purchaser does not believe you when you are speaking the truth to him, so you have to take an oath. And so this would happen just on the occasion, so that you are not someone who takes a deceptive oath, and neither are you someone who takes an oath every time you want to sell something. So if you have to take an oath just on the occasion because the other party does not believe you, then there is nothing wrong with that. But it's the first two categories that you need to worry about, because they will destroy the barakah in your earning. From the narration of the Prophet paying back an animal better than the one he borrowed, we may actually take that it is recommended that when paying back your debt, you pay back something which is better, and that this is not riba as long as it was not stipulated, because the Prophet spoke about being the best type of people who pay back the debt in the best possible way. And in the narration where the Prophet exchanged one servant for two servants after the servant had given him the pledge of allegiance, then if this could be done with servants, one servant for two servants, then a fortiori it can be done with animals, one animal for two animals. And so this is the point why Al-Imam Muslim put this hadith in the chapter under the heading of exchanging animals for animals. As for the ihtikar, which the Prophet said that the sinful person does, then does this include all types of merchandise and goods? The answer is no. It pertains to only those goods which, if hoarded up and the price increased, would harm the community. So this would be things like food and clothing and petrol and phones and so on. These are necessary items.
As for, let's say, if somebody hoards up toys until the price increases, well, the point is that people can do without toys. It's not a necessity. So if a person hoards up toys, that is not the sinful type of hoarding up. What we are talking about is hoarding up the necessary aspects of life.
Let us move to the next chapter of the Shufa'ah, or what's called the preemption. From Jabir ibn Abdullah, the Prophet ﷺ said, من كان له شريك في ربعة أو نخل فليس له أن يبيع حتى يؤذن شريكه فإن رضي أخذ وإن كره ترك. Whoever has a partner in a dwelling place or a date palm tree, then he is not allowed to sell it until he informs his partner. Then if the partner is happy and content with it, he can take his partner's share, so buy him out. And if he does not like it, then he can leave his share. Ash-shuf'ah, from the word ash-shafa', meaning even. And this is because in shuf'ah, or preemption, you double up, so you make it even. That is to say, the partner buys out the share of his partner, so he doubles up his share. So we have two people, let's call them A and B. They share in, let's say, a garden, or it could be a car, or it could be a house. Anything that is not divided, they are, let's say, equal sharers in that. If person A wants to sell his share to person C, he is not allowed to do that until he first seeks permission of person B, because person B is the partner. Now, if person B wants, he can buy out person A and double up on his share. If he does not, then person A can sell to person C. What is not allowed to happen is person A sells to person C without informing person B. And if such a thing does happen, then person B can forcefully buy out person C, because the right belongs to B, he's the partner. Why does the right belong to person B? Well, it is to safeguard his interests. It may be that person B does not like person C to be the sharer in the property, and so the right belongs to person B because he is the original partner, so the right belongs to him that no new person will enter into this particular property as his partner. The hadith says, Man kana lahu sharik, whoever has a partner in a dwelling place or a date palm tree. Now this partner is general, meaning to say it includes Muslim and a kafir. So even a kafir has the right of preemption, both a kafir over the Muslim and the Muslim over the kafir, no difference here. And this preemption, if it is a house, then the shuf'a is applicable if the home or the house has the same entrance. As for if there is a dividing wall in this house and it has two different entrances, then this is exactly the same as having two different homes divided by a wall, as you see with many houses. Now in a case like this, there is no shuf'a or preemption. They are two different distinct properties. The shuf'a applies to one and the same property, be it a house, be it a land, or a garden, or a car, and so on. The partner should be given a reasonable amount of time to make his decision. Does he want to buy out the seller, or is he okay with the partner selling it on to person C? So it's not the case that he immediately needs to make the decision. No, he is given a reasonable length of time. If he is absent, then he must be waited for.
It should be noted that the shuf'a is applicable even if the partner gives his share away as a gift, according to the correct opinion, because the illah, the justification, is still the same. You want to protect the rights of the sharik. Also, the shuf'a is applicable in all property, even such a property which, if divided, will become of no use, such as a small piece of land or an extremely small room that is being shared. The hadith is general, so we will keep it in its generality.
Let us move on to the next chapter about fixing a beam on your neighbor's wall. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يمنع أحدكم جاره أن يغرز خشبة في جداره. One of you should not prevent his neighbor from fixing a beam on his wall. And then Abu Hurairah saw the people did not like this hadith, and he said to them, ما لي أراكم عنها معرضين والله لأرمين بها بين أكتافكم. What's the matter? That I see you turning away from this injunction of the Prophet. By Allah, I will surely throw it between your shoulders. These types of things where your neighbor fixes his beam on your wall, so this is the wall which you and your neighbor share, this is not going to harm you. In fact, it will just reinforce the wall. And things like this should not be prevented because there is no harm on you and there is only a benefit for your neighbor and possibly the wall itself because it will reinforce the wall. So how then, after this, can you possibly prevent such an action? You are simply being gratuitously and unnecessarily stubborn, and such behavior is not allowed for anyone who claims to have Iman. Also, a behavior which is not allowed for anyone who claims to have Iman is what we witness in this narration when Abu Hurairah narrates the hadith to the people. They turn away from it because they did not like this idea that we have to let the neighbor fix the beam on our wall. Abu Hurairah said, I will surely throw it between your shoulders. We might understand this to mean, I will keep reciting this hadith to you even if you will hate it. Because it's not fitting for any mu'min to hate any hadith of the Prophet and to turn away from it. Rather, you have to submit and feel no qualms in your heart when the Prophet has given a decision. Another interpretation of this could be that Abu Hurairah is saying, forget the neighbor's wall, I will affix it on your shoulder blades if I have to. So you have to just admire how vehement Abu Hurairah and indeed all the other companions were when it comes to the injunction of the Prophet ﷺ. They must not be violated and certainly not turned away from. Rather, the whole idea of Islam is to submit to the Quran and to the authentic ahadith.
Okay, what is the hukum on this action here? We say that the hukum is that it is wajib for you to permit your neighbor to fix a beam on the shared wall if it will not harm you. If it will harm you and you can prove that to be the case, then you have the right to prevent him. It's as simple as that.
Let's move to the next chapter about taking land or usurping land unlawfully. This narration here where Sa'id ibn Zayd, one of the Al-Asharatul Mubashshara, had a dispute with a woman called Arwa. She claimed that he seized some land belonging to her, so she wanted it back, whereas Sa'id ibn Zayd said, no, I did not seize any land from you, such that I should give you some land. So they brought this dispute to Marwan ibn al-Hakam. Sa'id said, how can I take part of a land when I heard the Prophet ﷺ say, من أخذ شبرا من الأرض ظلما
طوقه
إلى سبع أرضين. Whoever takes a handspan of land unjustly, then Allah will tie around his neck 7 earths. To this Marwan said, I will not ask for any evidence from you after this. Sa'id said, making a dua to Allah, O Allah, if she is lying, then blind her and kill her in her own land. In another version it says, if she has told a lie, then make her blind and make her grave in her house. And so it happened that this woman, Arwa, became blind. And the narrator says, I saw her groping her way by touching the walls and saying that the curse of Sa'id ibn Zayd has hit me. And one day she was walking in her house and she passed by a well which she did not see and fell into it, and that became her grave. From this hadith we take it is haram to usurp any amount of land. A handspan is mentioned in the hadith, otherwise less than a handspan is also haram. These numbers and sizes in the hadith are just there by way of exaggeration. They are not intended in and of themselves. Similarly, how Allah Jalla wa Ala says, إِن تَسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ 70 مَرَّةً فَلَنْ يَغْفِرَ اللَّهُ لَهُمْ. If you seek forgiveness for them 70 times, Allah will not forgive them. This number 70 is just an exaggeration. Otherwise, a person is not allowed to say, well, I'll just seek forgiveness for them 71 times, and then the munafiqeen will be forgiven. No, the 70 number is just an exaggeration. So normally these numbers and amounts are not intended in and of themselves. We find it is a major sin because a specific punishment is given. 7 earths are mentioned, and this is because earth is 7 layers, just like the sky is 7 layers. So it's like saying the whole planet will be tied around your neck on Yawm al-Qiyamah. And the planet is what is used to punish you. Why? Because it's quite fitting you usurped part of the planet. From the hadith we pick up that the dua of the mazloom, of the one who is oppressed, There is no hijab between it and Allah Jalla wa Ala, because Sa'id ibn Zayd was the mazloom, was the oppressed here, and the oppressor was the woman, Arwa, demanding that Sa'id give her some part of his land. She claimed that Sa'id usurped it. And what is apparent is that she was lying, because Allah Jalla wa Ala accepted the dua of Sa'id against her, and she met a humiliating and painful doom. We seek refuge in Allah Jalla wa Ala from such a fate. Let's move to the next chapter about the amount of pathway if there is a dispute. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا اخْتَلَفْتُمْ فِي الطَّرِيقِ جُعِلَ عَرْضُهُ سَبْعَ أَذْرُعٍ. When you disagree or dispute about a path, then its width is to be made 7 cubits, 1 cubit being from your elbow to the end of your fingertips. If a person has some land and he wants to give some land and make it into a pathway for the general use of the public, then he can make it as large as he wants to. Of course, the wider the better. But what this hadith is talking about is if there is a dispute as to how wide to make the path, and so the people are disputing, then in such a dispute, the Prophet has just given a specific figure, 7 cubits. That is 7 cubits wide. And that should be plenty for the people to pass through.
However, this number, 7 cubits, is it to be applied in all times and places? Or do we say that the number depends on the customs of the people? The latter seems more sensible. It depends on the customs of the people as to what this sensible number should be. It may be that people require a more spacious public pathway. Maybe they're carrying heavy goods, or for some other reason. So, because of this, it makes more sense to say that the 7 cubits is not tashri', but rather it is tanzim. Tashri' means it is sharia, so it applies for all times and places. Whereas tanzim means regulating the affairs of the people, and this is a political issue, and therefore would vary from time to time and place to place. And Allah Jalla wa Ala knows best.
Let us now move on to the Kitabul Fara'id, the book of inheritance. Let's take the first hadith. From Usama ibn Zayd, the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يرث المسلم الكافر ولا يرث الكافر المسلم. A Muslim does not inherit a kafir, and a kafir does not inherit a Muslim. We take from this hadith exactly what it says, that there can be no inheritance between a Muslim and a kafir. This is because at the time of death, the ties are cut off, and the only tie which continues on ahead is the tie of Iman. That's the only bond. As for the blood bonds, then they are broken during the time of death. So whereas the asbab of inheritance, the causes for inheritance, are firstly the blood relation, secondly they are the marital relation, and thirdly the wala, where a person who frees a servant, he gets to inherit from that servant if the servant dies and does not have any other family members. But along with these asbab, there are mawani', preventative factors. And these are al-qatl, killing someone. If you kill the person you're meant to inherit from, and you do that intentionally, wanting his inheritance, then you are deprived of his inheritance. And secondly, if your deen is different. So a Muslim and a kafir do not inherit from each other. And thirdly, if one person is a servant, he will not inherit, because the wealth which he receives will actually go to his master. So the servant does not inherit from another person, even if he may be his son or his father, and so on.
And then we also have the shart, or the condition for inheritance, and this is that we need to know for certain that the inheritor has survived the deceased. So if we're not sure, because maybe they died at the same time, then there is no inheritance. So in total we have asbab, mawani' and shart.
So this hadith talks about one of these preventative factors, which is the difference between a Muslim and a kafir. They do not inherit from each other. As we said, their ties are cut off, even if they were most closely related by blood. Having said that, however, it is permissible to give a wasiyah or a bequest to a kafir. That is allowed, because a bequest is not the same as inheritance. Different rules apply to bequests. And a bequest is essentially giving somebody a gift only after your death. Now we know you're allowed to give a kafir a gift, and vice versa. And so therefore, to be able to do it after death is also fine. So therefore, if a man has, let's say, a kafir son, He knows that if he dies, his kafir son will not inherit from him. So what he can do is that he can specify a portion of his wealth as a bequest to his son. That is permissible. What is not allowed is that if this man dies, then this son of his should inherit from this man in accordance with how the Quran stipulates. That is not allowed. So we say that the presence of this kafir son will be like his absence. So note the difference then between the bequest and inheritance. The inheritance is dictated by the Quran. As for a bequest, it is up to you how much you want to give, as long as it does not exceed a third if you have other inheritors, and that they do not give you permission to exceed a third, because the right belongs to your other inheritors. The next hadith from Ibn Abbas, the Prophet ﷺ said, أَلْحِقُ الْفَرَائِضَ بِأَهْلِهَا فَمَا بَقِيَ فَلِأَوْلَى رَجُلٍ ذَكَرٍ. Give the fixed shares to their respective people. Whatever remains goes to the nearest male man. You have two main types of inheritors: those who have a fixed share, which the Quran has stipulated for them, and then the second type, and these are what we call asaba. They inherit whatever is left after the fixed shares have been given. And so this is what this hadith is talking about. It is a pivotal hadith, this one here, when it comes to matters of inheritance. This hadith, together with the 3 ayat of inheritance in Surah An-Nisa, they would form the bulk of the rulings of the inheritance. Not all of them, but certainly the bulk of them. So who are the people of the fara'id, plural of farida, which means a fixed portion, muqaddar, a fixed amount? Well, these are the spouse, so that would include the husband and the wife. It is the mother and the father. It is your sister, be it your full sister, consanguine sister, that's your half-sister from the father, or the uterine sister, that's the half-sister from the mother. It is your daughter and your son's daughter, and going down in that line, so the son's daughter, and so on. It is your uterine sibling, so your half-brother or sister from the mother's side. It is also your grandmother in the absence of the mother. And by grandmother we mean the proper grandmother, so that will be your mother's mother, or your father's mother, or your father's father's mother, or your mother's mother's mother. Basically it will not be the what's called the jadda fasida, the corrupted grandmother. And that is to say, if you go up in your family line, up your parents' line we're talking about, if you happen to have a situation where a male comes in between two females, the upper female would be the jadda fasida, the corrupt grandmother. So an example of that will simply be your mother's father's mother. Do you see that there is a male that has come between two females? So that type of grandmother is a jadda fasida. She does not normally inherit, rather she is from the dhu rahim, who only inherit in the absence of the people of the fard and the asaba. And then we have the asaba. These are the ones who will take the remaining. And so these are the males who are related to the deceased from at least the father. So we're talking about the father himself in certain cases. We did say that he is from the Ashabul Fard. Actually he's both, depending on the circumstances, but he can be from the Asaba as well. We're talking about the sons and the sons' sons and so on. We also talk about the father's father, and going up in that line. We are talking about your male cousins from the father's side. We are talking about the paternal uncles, note paternal, not maternal uncles, and going up in that line, so your brother's father, and also your father's father's brother, and father's 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 brother, and so on. Note, interestingly enough here, that your female cousins are not inheritors, neither from the fard nor asaba. There is also something called asaba bil ghayr, when somebody is an asaba with someone else, and this would be the daughter and son. This would be, for example, the daughter with the son. She shares 2-to-1 ratio. Also, your full sister with the full brother. She is an asaba bil ghayr. And also your consanguine sister with your consanguine brother. Again, there's a 2-to-1 ratio there. And then you have a third type of asaba, which we say asaba ma'al ghayr. And this is your sister, that is your full sister or consanguine sister, in the presence of a daughter. If a deceased leaves behind a daughter and a full sister or consanguine sister, then the full or consanguine sister takes the place of the brother. And we know that the brothers are from the asaba. This is just a brief summary. As for the details of all of this, then we have spoken about it elsewhere in our fiqh presentations. Let's move to the next chapter of Al-Kalala. Jabir ibn Abdullah says that he fell ill and the Prophet and Abu Bakr came to visit him. He says, I fainted, and then the Prophet performed wudu and sprinkled the water over me. He says, I felt some relief and then asked the Prophet, how should I judge with my wealth? The Prophet did not reply until the ayah of Surah An-Nisa, the last ayah, came down. يَسْتَفْتُونَكَ قُلِ اللَّهُ يُفْتِيكُمْ فِي الْكَلَالَةِ. They ask you, say that Allah gives you a fatwa concerning the kalala. Up until the end of the ayah. What is al-kalala? Well, this is the situation where a man or a person dies and he has no children nor any parents. So neither an asl, so that will be your parents, grandparents and so on, nor any furur, so that will be your children and grandchildren and so on. So what's happening here is that you only have either brothers or sisters to inherit from you. The ayah teaches us that if such a person only has one sister, then she will receive a half. And then obviously from the previous hadith we know that the rest will go to your closest male relatives. So maybe your uncle or your cousin and so on. We can take a fa'idah, a point of benefit from this hadith. You visit the ill. And we know this is one of the rights a Muslim has over another Muslim. And this is fardu kifaya. Somebody must visit, otherwise the whole community, those who knew about it, would be sinful. And the type of ill person we were talking about is the one who is bedridden. So we are not talking about somebody who has a cold, because when you have a cold you can still go out and go about your personal business. And then some etiquettes need to be observed. For example, you should not stay in his place for too long because you could overstay your welcome. And that you should make dua for him and speak words that will produce some happiness in him and relief. Take his mind off his illness. And then you can give him other advice such as increase in his acts of dhikr and tilawah of the Quran, because it is not likely that such a person is going to be working or be distracted by other activities. So make use of this time. Make your time of illness a time of benefit and barakah. If it appears that he is on his deathbed, then one would need to advise about making tawbah and writing a wasiyah if one is needed, and advice on keeping patient with the qadr of Allah Jalla wa Ala. How often should you visit him? Well, this is a customary matter. Whatever is customarily acceptable, then that is fine. So for many people, just visiting him once might be okay, but sometimes visiting more might be the proper way. It is difficult to put a number on this. We did say that visiting the ill is a fard kifaya, except it can be a fardu ayn upon you if it is a close relative who is ill, because in not visiting him, it would be cutting off ties of kinship, and that is haram. We also take from this narration that Abu Bakr is with the Prophet, and this would be usual. Abu Bakr radiallahu anh would almost always be with the Prophet. Wherever the Prophet went, he was his closest companion and ally. We also witness some of the barakah of the Prophet ﷺ here, where he put his wudu water on Jabir, and Jabir gained consciousness again after he fainted. And we intend by this the water that dripped off his body as he made wudu, not the water in the container. We also take that when you do not know, then do not give an answer. Just keeping quiet is better than giving a wrong answer, because the Prophet initially remained quiet until the ayah was revealed to him. Because otherwise you could be guilty of speaking against Allah without due knowledge, and you do not want that. It is a major sin. And it is how shirk starts. And it is how you misguide people. By making halal into haram and haram into halal, and just completely twisting the proper ruling. We also take that the Quran was sent down portion by portion, and sometimes in response to questions that were asked. Most of the Quran is not in response to questions that were asked, but some parts are, and this last ayah of Surah An-Nisa is an example. Allah Jalla wa Ala says in Surah Al-Furqan, وَقَالَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لَوْلَا نُزِّلَ عَلَيْهِ الْقُرْآنُ جُمْلَةً وَاحِدَةً كَذَلِكَ لِنُثَبِّتَ بِهِ فُؤَادَكَ وَرَتَّلْنَاهُ تَرْتِيلًا. And the kuffar say, why is the Quran not revealed to him all in one go? Thus do we send it down to you in portions, that we may strengthen your heart, and we revealed it to you gradually. So every time portions of the Quran are sent down, the Prophet and the mu'minun would increase in their iman. So like this then, their iman would remain constantly high, all throughout the 23-year revelation period. Likewise in Surah Al-Isra, Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَقُرْآنًا فَرَقْنَاهُ لِتَقْرَأَهُ عَلَى النَّاسِ عَلَى مُكْثٍ وَنَزَّلْنَاهُ تَنزِيلًا. And a Qur'an, a recitation, which we have split up. So you will recite it to the people in periods, and we have revealed it in stages. We can take from this narration that the ayah says that Allah gives you a fatwa. So we can say that Allah Jalla wa Ala is a mufti. This is not his name, but rather it is from the things which he does. So he gives a fatwa. But we are not allowed to say that one of the names of Allah is Al-Mufti, because for that we need clear-cut evidence, and we do not have any. We can say that Allah is a mufti just by way of giving some information about Allah. That is fine, but we cannot say that one of his names is Al-Mufti. In another wording of the hadith in the chapter, it quotes the ayah, يُوصِيكُمُ اللَّهُ فِي أَوْلَادِكُمْ لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ. Allah gives you an order with regards to your children, the male will have twice as much as the female. One may ask a question here, why does Allah Jalla wa Ala not say that the female will simply receive half of the male? Is there a particular intentional reason why Allah Jalla wa Ala put it the way He does? Well, it appears there might be. Because if you put it the way Allah Jalla wa Ala puts it, that the male has twice as much as the female, then these are words denoting more. Whereas if He said that the female has half of the male, then these are words denoting less. And words denoting more are more worthy than words denoting less. Secondly, it points out to us the virtue and the fadila and the higher rank that the male has over the female. So it is a bit more direct than simply saying that the female has half that of the male. That would be an indirect way of saying that the male is of a higher rank than the female. From this narration we can find that you can take barakah from the used water of the Prophet. But can you take barakah from the used water of some other righteous person? The answer here is no. And that taking barakah from the effects of someone is only applicable to the Prophet himself. This is specific. And the evidence which we have for this is that great companions like Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali and many others besides them, radiyallahu anhum, from the awliya of Allah Jalla wa Ala, nobody took barakah from their personal effects. And who, afterwards in this ummah, can be more virtuous than them? Let's move to the next chapter about the last ayah revealed in the Quran. Al-Bara ibn Azib says that the last verse of the Quran was the last ayah of Surah An-Nisa, يَسْتَفْتُونَكَ قُلِ اللَّهُ يُفْتِيكُمْ فِي الْكَلَالَةِ. Well, we actually have a few opinions as to what the last ayah of the Quran was. You can clearly see here that Al-Bara ibn Azib says that it was the ayah of Kalala at the end of Surah An-Nisa. Another one has been suggested, وَاتَّقُوا يَوْمًا تُرْجَعُونَ فِيهِ إِلَى اللَّهِ in Surah Al-Baqarah. Another ayah in Surah Bara'ah or Surah Tawbah has been mentioned. And it seems that every companion is narrating what they know to be the case. Or it may be that what Al-Bara means is that the last ayah from the inheritance ayat is the one in Surah An-Nisa, and the other companion narrating that it is the ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah. This is about riba.
However, the point is that there are many riwayat which speak about the last ayat to be revealed. And every companion is narrating what they think is the last ayah to be revealed. That being the case, we do not actually know what the last ayah to be revealed was. But that is not a problem, and we'll just leave it at that. Let's just pick up on a few more points of benefit. We have said already that the Muslim and Kafir do not inherit each other. Okay, what about a Kafir and a Kafir from two different adyan? So does a Christian inherit a Jew, or vice versa? You could have a man being a Christian and his brother is a Jew. Do they inherit from each other? Well, what appears to be the case is that they do not inherit from each other if we go by the generality and the apparent meaning of the authentic hadith. لا يتوارث أهل الملتين شتى. Two people of two different adyan do not inherit from each other. And there definitely is a difference of opinion here. The other opinion is understandable, that kuffar can inherit from each other, because kufr is all one millah. It's all one deen, with different madhahib, but all one deen. And that is understandable. And that when the Prophet said, Ahlul millatayni shatta, people of two different adyan, then this refers to kufr and Islam. And Allah Jalla wa Ala knows best. Okay, at this stage, let us take some questions. So question number 1, explain what the salam trade is, and explain the advantage to each of the purchaser and the vendor. Question number 2, what is the ruling on allowing your neighbor to fix a beam on the shared wall? Give the detail to this answer. Question number 3, what are the asbab, mawani' and shart of the inheritance?